Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chanan Weissman. I'm the director of SAPIR Institute, housed within Maimonides Fund, and I want to welcome what appears to be hundreds of you who have joined us for a special virtual conversation about the war between Israel and Hamas, now in its eighth day. Since June 13th, I've been thinking about that classic line from Lenin, not John, Vladimir, where he said, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." And I think it's fair to say that this past week was among the most consequential for the state of Israel in many decades. Because, and folks can correct me if I'm off base here, for the first time in more than half a century, I think really dating back to 1973, Israel is in direct conflict with another nation state. And not just any nation state, Iran. Iran is a major regional power, the second most populous country in the Middle East, the second largest country by landmass in the region, has the second largest military in the region, an ancient people led by a theocratic messianic regime that harbors nuclear ambitions, hegemonic aspirations, and an open desire to destroy the state of Israel. For decades, Middle East watchers have debated how best to contain, to dismantle, or even destroy Iran's nuclear program. Is it via diplomatic negotiations? Is it through sabotage, cyber warfare, assassinations? Or will it require direct military intervention? I think I was talking to a colleague earlier this week, and I said something to the effect of, I literally remember writing a paper in college some 20 years ago about whether the use of military force was the most effective way of preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon state. And finally, almost surprisingly, perhaps we shouldn't be, but almost surprisingly, here we are. In the early morning hours of June 13, with Hamas all but destroyed, Hezbollah in tatters, Nasrallah dead, Assad gone, Iranian air defenses crippled, and, according to public reporting, against the wishes of the Trump administration, Israel launched a remarkable attack against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, military leaders, ballistic weapons depots, and the like. We're now in week 2 of this war, and Israel is believed to have destroyed, I think, 2/3 of Iran's missile launchers, taken out part of the Natanz nuclear reactor, assassinated top military leaders and nuclear scientists. It owns the skies of Tehran. Meanwhile, Iran has lobbed more than 400 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 drones on Israeli cities. I think some 24 Israeli civilians killed, many more wounded, and the Iranian government reports that hundreds were killed there in Iran. And so as we enter Shabbat, the one question that is on everyone's mind is, will the United States enter the war? And if so, what might that look like, and what are the implications? Well, we're very fortunate to have two authoritative guests to help us make sense of this moment. One is retired Air Force Lieutenant General Joseph Guastella, a command pilot with more than 4,000 flight hours. General Guastella capped off his, I think it was 35 years of service in the Air Force as a 3-star general who led the U.S. Forces Central Command in the Middle East, during which time, as you'll recall, the IRGC mastermind Qasem Soleimani was eliminated and taken off the battlefield. And we also have Dana Stroul, who's the Director of Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East in the Defense Department from 2021 through 23. That means she led defense policy in the Middle East for the Pentagon and for the U.S. government. Cards on the table, I had the good fortune of working with Dana more than a decade ago when I was on the Joint Staff J5 as a young PMF. And I really continue to learn from her to this day, and you can too by watching her on CNN or reading her reports. So, General and Dana, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we dive right in, one last housekeeping thing. For those of you in attendance, regular SAPIR audience members, new folks, if you have questions, and we want you to have questions, Think about them throughout the conversation and place them down in using the QA function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll make sure to get to a handful of them in the final, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes of the hour. But there's so much to discuss, and I want to dive right in. General Guastella, let's start with you, and let's start with the headlines, okay? Because how could we not? All right, so after a few days of publicly deliberating whether the U.S. should join the fight, yesterday President Trump announced that he would make a decision within 2 weeks, in part to give negotiations a chance. So I know better than to ask you to read what's on the president's mind, but I am curious to what extent that impacts U.S. military preparedness, this 2 week window or less than. What are the upsides? What are the downsides to this type of pronouncement?
Well, for starters, I mean, I just want to comment that the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, have done an absolutely incredible job in their success this fast and this overwhelmingly with what they've done. And so it's put a lot of options on the table that weren't there before. And so by the fact that they dismantled the air defenses, they're able to now go after, basically unconstrained to go after the what we call power projection capability, rocket launchers, missiles on the rails, missiles in storage facilities. That campaign can continue along with pursuit of a counter-nuclear campaign. And so we've seen all of that unfold. But the thing that I think is most interesting right now is that by not making a decision to enter into this fight, the U.S. allows this Israeli campaign to continue, and which will continue to weaken the regime, continue to weaken their power projection capability, which certainly affects every Israeli citizen and everyone in the region, and continue. Basically, it allows the regime there to internalize what's happening to them, and they finding themselves less and less capable every single day that goes on. And so I know the white elephant in the room is the can the Israelis complete the destruction of the nuclear capability, and that that's the one piece that would could possibly require the United States to enter into this. But let me just stop there and say I think the U.S. is in a pretty good position given this 2 week window to allow some negotiations to occur.
So, just to piggyback off of that, Dana, what's your read? Is the president trying to use the leverage of Israel's military successes to secure a deal during this period of time? And then, how do you think that impacts? I think the general referred to. How do you think that impacts the IDF's decision-making calculus for this period of time as well?
Well, it appears that the Trump administration is actually using the leverage of this moment in order to explore whether there's new opportunities at the negotiating table. So, first of all, they are flowing a massive amount of force into the region, more fighter squadrons, more tankers, aircraft carrier groups, air defense. They've put more forces here in the United States on prepared to deploy orders, which means U.S. service members can't leave the base for too long in case they need to fly to the Middle East. These are really significant signals. And if you're sitting in Tehran and you're looking at it, it looks very serious. The U.S. is putting serious skin in the game, and they're preparing the theater in case the president should decide to direct the U.S. military to enter this campaign in an offensive way in order to strike at some of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But at the same time, I think what they're doing, there's a very important meeting taking place today in Europe, probably as we're speaking in this webinar, between the E3, so the European capitals, London, Paris, and Berlin, that were party to the original Iran nuclear agreement of 2015, with their Iranian counterpart, the foreign minister. And you could see, again, the Trump administration setting the theater for that conversation. Secretary of State Rubio had a series of calls with the different capitals of Europe before they go into this meeting. And all of this is testing whether or not Iranian positions to make concessions on their nuclear program have softened. And, I think where we are today is so vastly different from where we were last week as a result of Israel's stunning, the IDF's stunning operational progress, as General Guastella spoke about. I think if you're sitting in Iran and you're looking at it, this is not what you were thinking a week ago. And a week ago, the trajectory of the negotiations that the Trump team were leading appear to be at an impasse. And that impasse was about whether or not Iran could retain a domestic enrichment capability so that it would enrich uranium inside its own country. And in the view of Israel, many people here in the United States, and it looks like that same view is shared in Europe right now, is that retaining that domestic enrichment capability would enable Iran to have a pathway to go back towards a nuclear weapon if it wanted to at some point in the future. And if that position doesn't change, I think that is going to inform President Trump's decision making about what happens over the next 2 weeks. Now, what I think was really critical about the 2 week timeline is that what he said yesterday was within 2 weeks, not at the end of 2 weeks, which means presumably that he and his national security team will be constantly assessing where the military posture is and also what they're hearing from the negotiating table in Europe and what they're hearing from Iran. But 2 weeks is a really long time for the IDF to continue this pace of operations. And it's also a really long time for Israel's air defense at home to sustain the kind of engagement that it has in order to intercept these ballistic missile salvos. And so if I were Israel and I was looking at a 2 week time period, that seems to me very risky and fraught. I would rather have a decision from Washington sooner than 2 weeks.
Is there something to the 2 weeks itself, or is this a random number you think that the president decided to use?
Well, I'll take the question first. Apparently, if you were watching CNN yesterday or reading the New York Times, he really does like a good 2 week time window for different kinds of negotiations. So it's not new for President Trump when he's looking at a negotiation. He's trying to leverage pressure of the moment to say, "I'll give it 2 weeks and then I'll decide."
Hmm. General Guastella, I mean, Dana described how the U.S. military is moving all these additional forces to the region, right? Tanker planes, warships, I think two aircraft carrier strike groups, possibly a third. I don't know. These aren't, the Iranians are reading this not as efforts to protect American troops, assets, and allies, or are they? Alternatively, are they thinking about it in the context of, as Dan has described, no, 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 these are indications, these are signals of the U.S. potentially going the offense in case the president gives the orders.
I think it's a little bit of both. When you think about it, the force buildup that Dana described is what we term posture, right? What is the military posture in the region? And straight up, the United States had not been postured in the region to fight Iran, right? We were there protecting Israel. We were there defeating the ISIS caliphate, which we were very successful at several years ago, basically trying to tamp down terror.
In which you played an important role in.
I played a role in that. And that's what we were postured for. We were not postured for going to war with another country. But what you see here is the increase in posture to do both things that I think you described. The defense of American troops in theater, which were not as robustly defended when you're not fighting another country. And secondly, to put options on the table for the president. There's one thing that I know from being over there. Iran respects U.S. power. And if we don't demonstrate not only the ability, but the possible willingness to use it, we're often dismissed. And that's the way for any theocracy, dictatorship, even terror organizations. They understand power. And the negotiations that Dana's talking about need to come from a position of strength. And the strength is twofold. It's an offensive strength that we can hold targets at risk, and it also is a defensive one that protects U.S. service members. Because after the Soleimani attack, I suffered 12 ballistic missiles into one of my facilities, a couple of my facilities there in the Middle East. Fortunately, no Americans were killed. But what the U.S. has to consider here is the escalation that could result of they're entering into this, and that includes the lateral escalation that could be involved. And the best way to give the president options and to be able to handle contingencies that come from a U.S. involvement is to posture the force correctly. And that's exactly what you're seeing right now.
Okay, so Dan, I want to get to something that the general alluded to. All right, so let's say the president gives the orders. What does that mean practically? Does it mean that the U.S. would fly these B-2 bombers and drop these 30,000 pound, massive ordnance penetrators, known as the MOP, on like the nuclear facility in Fordo, which is buried within a mountain. And if the Trump administration declines to get involved, does Israel have the options, you think, to satisfy its war aims?
Yeah, it's really important questions. So first of all, what the Pentagon and U.S. Central Command, so our military headquarters for the Middle East, are going to do and probably have already done is present the president with a range of options. So the Pentagon's job and CENTCOM's job is to present a variety of options, and the president is the decider. And part of what the Pentagon will prepare for the president and CENTCOM is based on what the president tells them he wants to achieve. So if he says, I want to plan for getting at the deeply buried enrichment facility of Fordo in Iran, probably that option is going to include the use of B-2s and very serious munitions and things like this. He could ask for other kinds of end states. And if you're a good military planner, and I know the guys at CENTCOM are, they are creative, thoughtful, and committed. They have presented a variety of options to the president. And part of this posture buildup is so the president has decision space about what he wants to do and when he wants to execute those options should he decide to do it. One thing that I think is really important to distinguish is that we, as General Guastella talked about, this really significant posture in order to undertake offensive operations inside Iran should the president direct it. But that posture increase is already taking place on top of really significant posture increases since October 7th. So after October 7th, a lot of the military planning that prioritized the Asian Pacific theater and also the European theater to support Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine war, a lot of the work that President Biden directed was to prioritize increasing our posture, both to support the defense of Israel and also to support U.S. service members deployed across the Middle East who were under active threat and attack from Iran-backed militias, especially specifically in Iraq and Syria, and then later from the Houthis in Yemen. And then when President Trump came into office earlier this year, his administration increased that posture even more. More air defense went in. There were more aircraft carriers present to support that operation against the Houthis in Yemen. And now we're increasing again. So this is really a significant demonstration of U.S. commitment and investment. And if you listen to the political discourse here in Washington, D.C., and we know that Iranian leaders do, this is probably not what they anticipated from the United States. So they certainly have to be taking note and thinking that it's quite serious. In terms of what the IDF could do on their own, if you just take a step back, in my view, and look at what the IDF have accomplished since October 7th, and you articulated a lot of this in your opening remarks, but when I was leaving the Pentagon, and I'm not going to speak for the general, but we did not think about a scenario in which Hezbollah would be so decimated and depleted that it would agree to a ceasefire with Israel on terms very favorable to Israel, that all of the senior military leadership and a lot of the political leadership of Hamas would be eliminated, and Hamas would be so diminished that there's just some of them remaining in tunnels, that Bashar al-Assad would have run off to Moscow, and you'd have a new leader in Damascus who says the Iranians will not be able to use Syrian territory the way they had in the past, that militias in Iraq supported by Iran would largely be taking a knee at this point, that Israel would have been able to successfully strike inside Iran twice in 2024, successfully defend itself with the help of Arab militaries, the United States, and European militaries against that big ballistic cruise missile attack and drones last April, and then that Israel would again be able to defend itself against 180 ballistic missiles last October. And so what I'm saying is that this is a small but exceptionally capable, exceptionally innovative, creative military who is making use of emerging technologies. Think about the intelligence, penetration, the pager walkie-talkie operation in Lebanon. This is some really exquisite capabilities and exceptional military planning we've seen from the Israelis. And we have another example of really creative use of military force in the case of Ukraine a couple weeks ago with the operation it organized to attack Russian fighter aircraft deep inside Russia. And I say all of that because we here in the United States tend to think about U.S. fighter aircraft dropping big munitions in order to take care of the Iran nuclear program in the United States, in Iran. This is different. And I would not be surprised at all. In fact, I'm quite confident that the Israelis have all sorts of creative options for how to deal with this should the United States not join in.
Hey, Dan, can I pitch in on this? Really great laydown, and you're exactly right. That was one thing to pitch in, and maybe you can follow if I do. And that is the other interesting piece here is the Gulf Arab partners, because what we haven't seen is any pushback that I know of from the Gulf partners against this campaign. As a matter of fact, one of the, as CENTCOM knows well, to do anything in the Middle East, you have to have access, basing, and overflight. You have to be allowed to operate in and around these countries, sometimes over the top of them, and they have to allow that. And what we've seen here is not only the success that you described, the Israeli success that's, from their technology and their innovation and their expertise as a military, but the acceptance from the Arab states of letting them do some of these things. In some cases, we've had Arab states, this is prior to this current piece, Arab states actually interdicting missiles that were intended for Israel. And so that is a big piece here that I think has also changed since I was in the Pentagon and several years ago. And I don't know if you want to comment on that as an expert in your field.
One of the really interesting features of the reactions from regional governments in the past week is actually how muted the concerns have been. So if you look at the statements, if you were to read the newspapers here, it would say Saudi Arabia condemns Israeli aggression, so and so condemns. But actually, these are statements coming from unnamed spokespeople in the ministries of foreign affairs. They're not coming from the ministers of foreign affairs. No king or crown prince or president has come out in his own name to condemn this. And I also think there's a difference between some of the public rhetoric and what's happening behind the scenes. And that's pretty typical of the Middle East. So if you're a military or intelligence planner in any one of the Arab capitals, you would absolutely agree with Israel and with the United States that it is Iran that is the center of gravity and the driver of instability in the region. And that's the nuclear weapons program, that's the support for terrorism and militias and non-state actors, that is the menacing ballistic missile program and the suicide drone program. All of that threatens your security. And so what we have seen, I think, is relatively muted expressions of concern, some calls for de-escalation, but nobody is saying we're okay with Iran having a nuclear weapon program. Nobody is saying that. And actually, I thought one feature that was quite remarkable is the G7 statement. So all of the listeners here probably watched President Trump go to Canada and leave early. But as he was flying home from Canada, the statement from the other members with the United States of the G7 underscored Israel's right to defend itself and said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon capability. And I think that's also what the Iranians are going to hear today in Europe. And that those messages of alignment are really critical at this point in time. There's not calls for Israel to stop what it's doing. It's a very different tone and tenor from the criticism Israel has received for its operations in Gaza.
So to a certain extent, I mean, a lot of the countries, especially those in the Gulf, are riding on the coattails of the success of the Israeli Air Force and all the various efforts within Iran. To what extent do you think that's going to impact, let's say, the Israelis and perhaps we, the Americans, are successful in taking out some of these nuclear installations and dismantling the program overall, and precisely what that looks like? Let's place that on the side for a second. How does this impact the appetite of some of these other countries in the region to join forces with Israel and perhaps build upon the Abraham Accord successes of years past? Does it make it more or less likely if Iran is defanged? And I don't know, General, if you have a take on
Yeah,
that. If not,
I
Dan,
can comment on it and then let Dana go. I think, look, I think there was a lot of success with Abraham Accords, and I think that right up until October 7th, there would have been even more higher chance of more countries signing on to the Abraham Accords. But after October 7th, that kind of put everything on pause. I think there actually is an opportunity here for a big reset in the theater, where there's more countries that recognize Israel's right to exist, sign on to the accords, establish those negotiations, and do so with a much weakened Iran. Because, as Dana mentioned, they were the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. They sponsored proxies as the Ring of Fire, I think is the term, right? Proxy forces that surrounded Israel, were hitting them from every side. That was funded and supplied by Iran. And now, as Dana said, that's been completely neutered. Iran doesn't have they barely have their own force projection capability coming out of their own country, much less the ability to support those proxy forces. So as a result, there's a chance, I think here is, Gaza still hangs out there, by the way. That campaign is still ongoing. But I think there's a chance once we do find a ceasefire, and so either through negotiation or something else, I think once we find that, I think the door is open for more countries to sign up to the Abraham Accords.
I agree. Let me just say, I think there's a tension in the region. So if you think about President Trump's visit to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, it was all about economic deals, all about economic growth and engagement. It wasn't really about big announcements about Gaza, the two-state solution, Iran. And a lot of this is in line with what the region wants and what President Trump is hearing from the leaders of the region. They are very focused on their own economies, their own populations, their desires to make deals, grow. Many of you who are listening have probably heard about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, Vision 2030, which is a visionary plan for economic and social transformation to deliver more for Saudi citizens. So that doesn't work if the region is mired in war and conflict. So these leaders, they want peace, they want calm. And what President Trump heard during his visit was, we don't want you to strike inside Iran. We want you to negotiate. We want you to keep at the diplomacy. On the other hand, I stand by what I said earlier. All of them see Iran as a menace, as wanting to dominate the region, not just be a member of the region, but dictate the outcome and the processes of the region. And that Iran has consistently cultivated sub-state groups, non-state groups, militias, and proxies to threaten and keep certain governments weak and held back from realizing and responding to the aspirations of their people. So at this point, given where the Israelis are in their operational campaign, I think privately you'd hear a lot of leaders of the region say, well, now that you're there, finish it. Don't leave it. Don't leave it intact. Don't leave it in such a place where the Iranians can just rebuild it. The question of the United States, I think, is a really important one here. At the end of the day, whatever happens with this military campaign doesn't end with military force. There will have to be talking. There will have to be diplomacy on the other side. And whatever the Iranians might agree to, there will always need to be vigilance, intelligence, monitoring, things to happen to make sure they can't revert to their pre-existing nuclear weapons program. And that's going to take the United States being able to work with allies and partners in the region. And that's why it's going to be really important for the Gulf countries in particular, and also the Europeans, to be closely consulted as the waters, I think, of diplomacy are tested.
Yeah. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, and I see a number of them trickling through, we'll get to them in about 10 minutes or so. And so continue to share what's on your mind, and we'll try to get to at least a handful of them. I want to follow up on something that you mentioned, Dana. So let's say we or the Israelis or together are successful in taking out Fordo. That's not necessarily mission accomplished, right? So let's start with you, Dana. When do you think Israel will feel satisfied that it has sufficiently achieved all of its goals? I'm thinking about yesterday, Israeli Foreign Minister Katz said Ayatollah Khamenei cannot continue to exist. So that seems like perhaps a little bit of mission creep from the original intent of destroying the nuclear infrastructure of Iran, but perhaps it's not. What's your sense?
I think it's an expansion of the military objectives. So where the Israelis started out was wanting to dismantle or neutralize Iran's nuclear program and its missile arsenal, inventory capacity, industrial military complex, so that it can't threaten or rebuild or build more ballistic missiles to hold the entire region hostage and captive. Talking about the supreme leader needing to go sounds a whole lot like regime change or regime collapse. And when President Trump says things like unconditional surrender without articulating exactly what behavioral changes or concessions related specifically to the missile program, to the nuclear program, Iranian support for terrorism, when you hear something like unconditional surrender, it generally doesn't induce the adversary to take a knee and say, okay, now I'm going to just give it all up and negotiate. So what President Trump has talked about is not regime collapse. He has talked about wanting to make sure Iran cannot have a path to a nuclear weapon. And so I think the Minister of Defense of Israel, Minister Katz, yesterday, talking about the Supreme Leader needing to go, puts at risk a divergence between what U.S. goals may be and Israeli goals.
What's your read, General?
Yeah, no, I agree. That divergence that definitely could occur. But as was correctly stated, the priorities are the counter nuclear effort. That's priority number one. Top priority is air defenses, because without air defense takedown, you can't do anything. And so they successfully did that, which I think they stated they had air superiority over Tehran within only a couple days, which is astonishing. But that freedom of maneuver in the air allows them now to prosecute everything else. The top priority on the list is the power projection capabilities, the rockets and the missiles, the launchers, and the infrastructure. But what also now is on the table is setting Iran back in a financially, economically, militarily farther and farther. And as this campaign goes on, there's many target sets that are very high value, if you will, that to the Iranian government, that can weaken them, like I said, economically and other ways. That's on the table. All of that's on the table, shy of regime change, right? That's a whole nother level of discussion. But the longer this goes on, certainly I know a large focus of the IDF will be on the the things that can hit Israel, right? That's what they're going after. And then their ultimate ability to weaken Iran economically, so they can't fund terror elsewhere and they can't transfer technology elsewhere. And I think those are the targets that'll be on the table here, short of regime change.
If I could just
So,
add there,
yeah, please.
what the Israelis did that was, so there's a difference between what one could define as a military target and then expanding it into what many will classify as civilian targets. And the expansion in the first couple of days to some domestic gas production facilities and oil and gas storage facilities in Iran, I think is very significant and needs to be paid close attention to. So from an Israeli perspective, what they did essentially, let's say one of those areas was like a gate with the facility on the inside. The Israelis knocked on the gate and gave a signal. If you continue to send ballistic missile salvos and target our population centers, we could do very extensive damage to your oil and gas infrastructure. And that is Iran's economic lifeline. But that is very risky, because what it does is send a signal to Iran that oil and gas infrastructure is on the table for targeting. And we've actually seen in response some of the Israeli infrastructure in Haifa targeted. And that, of course, makes the rest of the region very nervous, particularly in the Gulf, who also have economies dependent on the export of oil and gas.
Actually, I was going to go to this question, but I am now, in part because you referenced the Iranians attacks using ballistic missiles targeting different parts of the Israeli civilian population. What do either of you make of the fact that there appears to be a dwindling number of ballistic missiles being lobbed over and sent to Israel? I think last night there was one. I mean, still pretty extensive damage and awful things taking place, for example, at Soroka Hospital in Beersheba. But it seems like there's, it's moving in a particular direction. And is this an indication that the Iranians are, they're trying to maintain access for as long as possible for as many of their ballistic missiles that they have? Is it because the Israelis have taken out the launchers and they have like limited access to be able to lob these over? What's your read? Maybe let's start with you, General, and then let's go with you to you, Dana.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the reason why they've diminished is because of Israeli success. I mean, they've gone after the launchers. The launchers are very vulnerable because when the launcher's out in the open, if it has a missile on it or not, you hit it because that means it won't be able to shoot a missile tomorrow. And so the storage facilities, and I'm sure Iran that's all they have left from the looks of it. Now they have a lot of little options with terror groups around the world that could probably do damage around the world. That let's never discount that. But in terms of direct state v state, all they have is the ballistic missiles and to some extent those long range drones, which are apparently very ineffective when there's defenses against them. But yes, it's a testament to the Israeli success. But I think they want to keep as many of those quote silver bullets as they can, just to preserve some response back. And so it all comes down to what we call WRM, war reserve material. What is your magazine depth? How much do you have left, right? And Iran it, used quite a bit of their arsenal up until now, and then when the arsenal is interdicted, as you've seen so successfully by not 100% obviously, but very successfully by Israel and to some extent U.S. support, that has really put the cuffs on what options they have left. And so it's definitely everything. It's twofold of what you said. It's a combination of the success of the Israeli military and the fact that Iran doesn't have unlimited coffers.
Right. Dana, what's your take on this?
I agree. I think it's an open question, but it's basically all of the above. On the one hand, it's a tactical decision to preserve some of the missile arsenal. So when President Trump says within 2 weeks, everyone hears 2 weeks. And so for Iran, they're thinking, okay, we have to have enough missiles left to provide us response options over a 2 week period. And the Israelis have already taken out a significant number of their storage areas and their launchers. So some of this is about preserving for future options. Some of it's probably an Iranian decision to preserve should the United States decide to enter this war and take part in strikes inside Iran. And so they're reserving some of those missiles to fire at U.S. bases and U.S. forces and U.S. aircraft carriers. And then so I think it's both a decision to tactically preserve at this moment in time. Some of it is they're slowing down because of Israeli operational success, and some of it is preserving options for the future.
Right. The one great concern was that the Iranians would completely overwhelm the missile defense capabilities of the Israelis by lobbing dozens, perhaps hundreds, and it seems as if they've opted not to go that route. Um, let's talk briefly, and one more question, and then we'll go to, I see a lot of really excellent questions in the queue. Um, we haven't really talked about, I think, the day after, sort of these post-conflict scenarios. And Dan, I want to start with you here. Is there some group waiting in the wings that's incredibly well organized, that has the backing of a vast majority of Iranians, that can step in if the regime falls? Um, what's your read on this situation?
There is no indication that there is one group sufficiently organized to step in should this regime collapse. And if you think back to some of the protests that have really captured world attention in Iran, women, life, freedom, the ones before that, and actually right before the Israeli operation, there were truck drivers all over Iran protesting. And this was a regime that was on its back foot. Wasn't able to deliver electricity. Kids weren't in school 5 days a week. People weren't going to their offices. Largely, Iranian citizens viewed the regime as corrupt, inept, not responsive to the needs of its citizens. But there has not yet been any opposition group organized within Iran that has demonstrated the ability and the will to take over in the absence of this current regime. I think there's also probably a lot of attention paid to certain external groups who have advocated, either former, members of the former Shah's family, or certain opposition groups that get a lot of attention in the United States. But those are not groups or individuals who have been on the ground in Iran and necessarily have popular support inside the country. And so this, I think, is a very fraught question. and a fraught challenge where you won't find much disagreement, I think, almost anywhere, other than maybe Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang, that this is a very problematic regime who is sponsoring terrorism, pursuing a nuclear weapons program, and doing all sorts of destabilizing activities. But the question is, on the other side of this regime, is there actually a better outcome that's going to deliver the peace, stability, cooperation, take Iran to where we'd like it to be, joining the community of nations? That's very much in question, and it's not clear at all that there is.
Okay, great. General, unless you want to weigh in on that, I think I would delve into some of the questions. No?
No.
All right. Well, General, to go to you. This one, Frank Brodsky said, please address implications of reports of Israel defense arsenal being very diminished. Is it possible, there's a certain allotment of missile defense capabilities that they have, which the Israelis are using almost every night. Is that something to be concerned about?
You want me to
Yeah,
answer?
I think.
General, okay.
Oh no.
Commander Guastella, yeah.
No, I think it absolutely is. I mean, I have no intelligence connections with Israel, so I can't comment on their, what I call their magazine depth on the defensive side. I do know that it's a very cost imposed. Ballistic missiles and the drone attacks are very much a cost imposing strategy. When you can shoot 200 of them, it requires very expensive shots back from Israeli systems, American systems that may be in country. And it's definitely cost imposition. But I think what we're seeing is, that the Israelis knew and had a pretty good idea of what Iran was capable of, or they wouldn't have entered into this campaign. And we've already seen Iran expend a significant amount of its arsenal, even well before this part of it. And with the Israelis have also understood the success of their own defenses against it. Not every missile that comes over needs to be engaged. If it's not going to go at something high value, if it's going to land in a field, you assess it, it may not need to be engaged, and you can preserve your defensive weaponry. And so I think I can't comment on exactly Israel's posture, but I do know that they have the support of the United States, and they went into this campaign understanding the force levels that were on the table.
Thank you. And then unless you want to weigh in, I have a question for you from Marty Siegel. It seems that humans are good at thinking about the quote next step, but I rarely hear discussion about what happens after that step is taken. War is unpredictable. How are the trade-offs weighed between the immediate goal versus the long-term challenges? We clearly don't want to get into a 10-year plus war, do we? And you kind of alluded to elements of this in your most recent answer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question, and I think it is unfortunately all too predictable that many governments, not just our government, tend to prioritize the short-term, immediate over long-term strategic challenges, and this is a good example of that. So if the national security decision-making apparatus is operating the way it should, then the president is getting briefings about what's happening to the best of our knowledge inside Iran and what the scenarios look like on the other side of this military campaign, whether it's Israel on its own, Israel plus the United States, whether it successfully degrades and sets back the nuclear program and the missile arsenal, estimates of the operational success, what it looks like to have the regime intact, but the program's degraded, if the regime is compliant and willing to negotiate, if you have a non-compliant regime who's towing the line and making no concessions, but there's this military action, and then if there's regime collapse and what happens on the other side. So that should be a conversation that's happening. And certainly in the president's campaign, and a lot of his cabinet members have spoken very critically of U.S. decisions in Iraq and Afghanistan in a rush to go in without sufficiently thinking through what happens on the other side of conflict. And the U.S. military, General Guastella knows this better than I do. There's after active combat operations, there's something called stabilization, phase 4, because the military understands that what happens after war, after combat operations, is almost more important than what happens during. If there's not societal buy-in and a plan for a political arrangement after, you could inadvertently make a much more unstable, unpredictable situation. And so those are the conversations that President Trump's team should be having with him as he thinks through entering into this war.
Yeah, can I
Um,
comment on one thing? Dana, you're absolutely right. Can I comment on one thing? And that is, some contingencies that could also result from this that I know CENTCOM and the administration have to be looking at is there's currently this wars between Israel and Iran, right? That's who's playing it out. But there's possibility for lateral escalation or global impact if Iran were to try to close the Straits of Hormuz, which is a very narrow waterway where so much of the world's oil passes. And that is something that they have the ability to do. Now, I would think that Israel is aware of that and probably prosecuting some of the methods they would use to close that. But that is something that's on the table that would have a global effect, right? And then it could also, cause other people to get into this fight. And so there's a lot of contingencies and options that are out there that could still happen. That I'm sure, as Dana said, I would be hopeful that the administration is thinking through all of those.
Anonymous asked, Israel made a decision to attack Iran last Friday based on intelligence that the Iranians were marching quickly to weaponize uranium and move toward a nuclear weapon. But in March, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence assessed that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. So maybe Dan, let's go to you. How is there such a wide gap between the Israeli and American intelligence assessments on the weaponization process?
So first of all, this is a really important point, and I think that as our country, the United States, contemplates entering into this war in Iran, the American people deserve to understand the intelligence laydown. That is a critical, that I think it's absolutely critical that there be some level of transparency about this. So what the Director of National Intelligence, Ms. Gabbard, said was actually quite consistent with some of the assessments that have come out of the Director of National Intelligence for at least the past 2 years. And what it says is that the Iranian government was taking more technical steps to position itself to rush for that nuclear device should the political decision be made to do so. So essentially, the whole apparatus of the nuclear program in Iran was preparing itself. So if the Supreme Leader said, okay, I'm ready to cross the nuclear threshold, they were ready to do it and execute as fast as possible. But that political decision to do it had not happened yet. And I think it's important to put in context that that intelligence assessment was coming at the same time that the IAEA, which is an international body, put out a comprehensive report actually only a few days before Israel started its operation. And in this comprehensive report, it talks in unambiguously clear terms that there is no possible peaceful explanation for the nuclear steps that Iran is taking. And so you had both this international organization raising the alarms about the steps the Iranians were taking. And in fact, they had announced another enrichment facility only about 48 hours before Israel started its operations. And you have this intelligence assessment. Now, what the Israelis have appeared to suggest is they had an additional intelligence assessment or estimate that the situation was even more dire than everybody taking as many steps to come right up to that line as possible should the Supreme Leader make the decision, and what the IAEA was saying. But the Israelis have not provided any more clarity about what that specific damning piece of intelligence was.
Okay. General Costello, this is from Phyllis Epstein. Okay. If the U.S. does not agree to help Israel, what are their options? I assume there means Israel. Are there any other allies that Israel might be able to count on in the region to help it in achieving its military objectives?
It's a great question. Israel doesn't have a lot of allies that I think would go offensive to support them. But remember, the Gulf partners are providing access to airspace, and that is a tremendous difference than it would have been 10 years ago. And so they do have, and Dana stated it quite well. they're being allowed things, even though there's public statements against them. They're being allowed things, or things are being allowed to happen that would never have happened 10 years ago, that gives Israel the freedom of maneuver. Dana mentioned it, but I think Israel, that they're very aware of the facilities, the nuclear situation. While they don't have all the weaponry required to do this, I think they can do a significant damage to, again, Iran's ability to project power outside of its soil. That in effect Israel, and I think they will continue to prosecute that until they feel like Israel's been set back far enough. The physics on the particular target set are very difficult without certain weapons, yes, but I think Israel still has a lot of options on the table, or they wouldn't have undertaken this campaign.
Okay, thank you. Another anonymous question to you, Dana. The U.S. Joining in offensive military operations would mark a significant departure for Israel, which since has based its security doctrine on the ability to defend itself by itself. There are significant. So, what are the implications, I think, for Israel if, from a strategic doctrine perspective, if the U.S. decides ultimately to join the fight?
This is an absolutely critical issue. I've been thinking about this a lot myself. So if you think about what Israel has done militarily, what the IDF have done since October 7th, the offensive operations, as you say, Anonymous, have been executed by the Israelis on their own. The U.S. has supported the defense of Israel, but it's not participating in these offensive military operations in Syria, in Lebanon, now in Iran, not in Yemen, etc. And part of what the Israelis were doing was to eliminate the ring of fire, as General Guastella spoke about, but it was also to restore deterrence so that an adversary, whether a state adversary or a non-state actor, would think twice about ever challenging Israel again in the manner that so many did after October 7th. And so now, given all of the operational successes that Israel has achieved in this first week in this campaign in Iran, I think there is a question about what it would mean for Israel that they couldn't finish it on their own, that they got themselves involved in and committed to a military campaign and could not complete it without the United States. And I also think there are important questions for the United States about this. Generally, the strategic rationale for this partnership is that the United States provides significant security aid, military aid, transfers U.S. origin weapons, and does some co-production with Israel. But Israel is a strategic asset for the United States because it doesn't rely on or need the United States to take care of its own defensive and security needs. It does it on its own, by itself, an Israeli way. And so I think for members of Congress or others who are looking at this and thinking through what it means that the Israelis made a decision to start this campaign on their own and then couldn't get out of it without the United States will likely open up the United States as well to tough questions about the strategic nature of this partnership. So it would be a really significant evolution in Israeli security doctrine, and I think also open up questions for the United States.
Jen, any thoughts on that question?
No, I think Dana answered it really well.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to sum up a lot of questions that we're getting into like one overarching question, and then I have a final one, and then we'll call it a day. So many people are asking whether the U.S. or Israel would support or promote an Iranian civilian uprising, and or whether this is likely something already in the works. This is a toss-up. Who wants to grab that ball?
I'll say one thing really quick before maybe before Dana. When I was in the region for several years and would meet with former defense ministers in Qatar specifically and in other regions, other countries there, they always told me, the best way to change the regime in Iran is from within, right? And it would not happen as a result of direct U.S. It would happen as an afterwards, and in a way that the Iranians did it themselves. And I think that is the best solution here. And if there's things that can be done to allow the Iranian people to make such a decision, I think that should be on the table. But from the Gulf partners, they don't think they also have seen the U.S. come in and do a regime change to the left and to the right of Iran, and they've seen what that's bought us. Dana mentioned it, what that involves in the stabilization phase and the unpredictable outcomes of those campaigns and all the losses that we took trying to stabilize countries. There's little appetite for it, but from within, different story. And so I'll let Dana, maybe color that a little better.
Uh, I agree on the skepticism about the United States directing or trying to orchestrate a change in government. But what the United States has consistently done for many years now is support civilians and advocacy and human rights organizations inside Iran. Because what the Iranian regime fears is freedom of information, freedom of association, protest gathering, and it has adopted and infiltrated, created a police state, tried to suppress the free flow of information, tried to restrict its citizens from accessing the outside internet and information, tried to manipulate information. I could go on and on. So what the United States has done is try to enable Iranian citizens to have information. If they want to organize, fine. So, for example, supporting VPNs. Elon Musk talked about Starlink in the past week so that Iranians could at least get information. The government actually in the past week has responded by trying to stop the internet. And so the only news Iranians are getting is corrupted news from their own government. Free flow of information, human rights monitoring, these sorts of things. So the United States has a record of trying to give citizens the resources to do these things, but not specifically intended to cultivate or foment an uprising, and certainly never armed opposition groups.
Excellent. All right. We're going to end where we began because we have to. And here's the final question. You both have to answer it, okay? And it's as follows. July 4th is about in 2 weeks from now, right? Within those 2 weeks, do you think that the United States will get involved militarily? Yes or no? So I'm going to give, I think we started with General Guastella, so we're going to start with Dana here, and then we'll go to General Guastella.
I do not. I think that the Israelis have demonstrated remarkable capability, and nobody would have, it would never have been on my bingo card a week ago that the Israelis would control airspace over Tehran and most of Western Iran. They are successfully executing their campaign faster than they anticipated that they would. They're actually moving faster. And I have seen the Israelis put together very creative, innovative. This is a startup nation utilizing emerging technologies and their exquisite intelligence capabilities to tackle really difficult problems. But I think the really significant U.S. military buildup and now this exploration of whether the Iranians can return to the negotiating table will be such a tipping point in President Trump's thinking.
I agree. I think what's different between any previous nuclear negotiations and now is the fact that Iran has been neutered. And so much has been revealed about their weaknesses, and they've basically been, frankly, the leader is in hiding. Okay, so it's a whole different status level to negotiate the nuclear peace now than it would have been at any other time in the last 2 decades. And so I think as a result of the phenomenal success of the IDF, combined with the seriousness of the U.S. posture, and frankly, to some extent, the unpredictability of the administration, which in this case it bodes very well for concern in the Iranian decision makers' minds, that I think the potential for negotiation is high. And therefore, I would say I don't think we'll have to, as a nation, have to get involved in that fight.
All right, well, listen, thank you both. Thank you, Lieutenant General Joseph Guastella. Thank you, Dana. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your erudition. Really, thank you for your service also for many years working in the U.S. government. We are the beneficiaries, I think, of a lot of your thoughts and ideas and expertise on the issues in the Middle East. I know that many of us are entering into Shabbat and entering into the weekend with a lot of questions that I think you helped us answer. So our deep appreciation to you and to all of you who have joined today, the hundreds of you. Feel free to join this broader SAPIR network. Go to sapirjournal.org. You can get copies of our journal for free. And just a reminder that on Monday, June 23rd, our editor-in-chief, Brett Stevens, will be in conversation with Sarah Foreman, who's the executive director of the New York Solidarity Network, and Mark Rotenberg, the senior vice president for university initiatives and general counsel at Hillel International, talking about a very different topic, Jewish activism. But on behalf of the broader SAPIR team, thank you, Dana. Thank you, General. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great weekend and Shabbat Shalom.